A fashion media and communication with international magic present. Hyper bodies. A summit on the
Role of bodies in a more than human world.
Nat Dryhurst. Protocols and identity play.
My name's Matt. So my wife Holly and I run an art studio here in Berlin. We've been calling Herndon Dryhurst Studio. I think a lot of people are familiar with us for music work we've done over the past decade or so. But in tandem with that, we've been developing an art practice. I think it's quite idiosyncratic in so much as one, we develop a lot of software in-house. And so the idea, and this speaks to the music stuff that we do too, is that, we develop software that allows us to make the art we want to make. And oftentimes the art we want to make requires some customization or some stuff that doesn't currently exist. And I guess the other part that maybe this presentation will allude to is, we kind of are interested in developing protocols for living with the software of others, right? And that will become really clear later, right? Like we have control over the kind of tools we can make and, the kind of experiences that can create, but ultimately the world is complex and there's lots of other people making software too. And so part of the art practice is also trying to structure protocols for how to deal with that. And as far as we're concerned, the software we produce ends up producing a lot of things people would traditionally consider art, visual art, performances, music, whatnot. But we actually want to be pretty clear. Like we think that the software itself and the protocols, the ways in which you interact with it, are also artworks in and of themselves. And that's that's something we'll argue about till we're blue in the face. But anyway, so that's us. We've been working, I guess the two themes that we'll touch on in this presentation, there's going to be a really heavy machine learning AI dimension, which of course a lot of people are really excited about now, which makes me excited. But we've been working with machine learning systems since about 2015, 2016. This is a picture of the first rig where we were training neural networks to sing. We put together a bunch of performances. We put together a choir that would sing with our singing neural network system, and took that process on tour. But in tandem, we've also done a lot of work in crypto. Prior to Web3, my personal engagement with crypto goes back to 2013, where I first got interested in the idea of smart contracts building a decentralized publishing framework. And the one thread that will maybe continue throughout this presentation is the original idea there, which was, 10 years ago now, was really thinking about, different ways of publishing media online, and also ways to give artists, creators more control and more permissions around how their work is interacted with online. And so for me personally, that's been, I don't try to be obsessed with it, but it's just been this constant reoccurring thing. I think that, digital media, the way we interact with the web, could just be so much more interesting than putting, representations of analog media online. There's so much more we could do, but we haven't got there yet. And I actually think that the advent and kind of the greater adoption of crypto and now machine learning, we're going to start seeing a lot more of that, and that's what gets me excited. And that's also why I'm pretty insistent that these protocols should be considered artworks. I think in 100 years' time, many of them will be, and many protocol engineers will be recast as artists once you understand exactly what went into the work that they do. Anyway, so some vernacular that's kind of useful. So for those who are familiar with, let's say, machine learning generated works, we've come out and put forward or proposed some words to use, pretty much to suggest that, we're in a kind of 21st century moment, and there's a lot of analogies that people make when they see, let's say, a DALL-E image or something like this. They make analogies to sampling or, synthesis, or any of these kind of very familiar 20th century ideas we have. And we like to use the term spawning in this context, because, once you kind of get into the weeds of this kind of field, like AI in general, is kind of a new deal. There are analogies you can make, and you can, of course, learn things from historical precedent, but the ways in which art is created, the ways in which art rituals or the kind of collective appreciation of art exists is going to get very, very abstract and very, very weird. And so I think that the metaphors that we use of sampling, collage, or whatnot are just kind of insufficient. So we're putting forward this idea, and I'll probably use it a few times, of spawning, which is, rather than creating new artworks from samples of old recordings or images, it's creating new artworks trained on recordings or the imagery of artists, right? And we think it's orders of magnitude more significant to the creative economy than sampling has been. And the example I bring up there is, if you think about, like, put yourself back into the 1950s, 1960s, and imagine that this kind of explosion of alien technology would hit people a couple of decades later, where all of a sudden you could kind of sample a recording and take a recording from a Bowie record and pitch his voice up and down. Imagine like how small deviations in the tools we use completely transformed the creative landscape, the communications and media landscape that we understand. I would argue that what we're seeing in machine learning, and perhaps sometimes in concert with crypto, is going to have as big an impact on that. So the good news about that, of course, is that once you get excited about these topics, your wildest idea, I think, is probably closer to where this is going to end up in 10, 20 years than, thinking of a way of being like, oh, how do we make Spotify for AI, or how do we make some analog to something we've already existed, something that's already existed, which of course is a really cool space to exist in, and means that it's all to play for, so to speak. So the other thing, term that we'll use that's maybe very, very related to, it's pretty much related to everything I'm going to show you afterwards, is, you hear a lot when it comes to AI about intellectual property. One thing that's important to understand is a lot of the intellectual property protocols we used still today were kind of designed for a pre-internet time. My argument is that, what's coming next is really going to exhaust that metaphor too. You hear a lot about deepfakes. There's some legitimate criticisms there, worrying about disinformation and so on and so forth. But we prefer to take a more kind of productive, optimistic view on this and use the term identity play. It's a play on IP. And we believe that artists will soon encourage you to make artworks inspired by them, in collaboration with them, or even as them. And so in the studio, we've been building the infrastructure to make this available to artists and their audiences. We use ourselves as kind of test subjects first before releasing these tools to everybody else. We started, so one project, excuse me, I'm boiling. So one project that's maybe relevant here, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with CLIP, so contrastive language image processing. It's a guidance model that's used. So basically when you go to DALL-E or Midjourney or something like this, Stable Diffusion, and you type in words, CLIP is what allows for you to find images in latent space. And it turns out, as you'll know, that, when you type in a painting in the style of Monet, the word Monet is recognized by CLIP and allows you to find areas in the latent space that reference Monet in some way. It just so happens that, Holly, I didn't, which is terrible, but Holly passed a threshold of notoriety sufficient that she's actually known by CLIP. And so this is a project we did in 2021, just immediately after CLIP came out, doing a series of CLIP portraits called Classified, basically trying to understand what CLIP knew of Holly, right? Because this is a very abstract representation of her that is now publicly available to everybody. If you go to a service, like a Midjourney or a DALL-E or whatnot, and you type in Holly Herndon, you'll be able to generate a kind of approximation of Holly. It's not actually Holly. It can't tell the difference between an artwork Holly's made or a promotional photograph of Holly, but it's somewhat of a hallucination of who Holly is. And so we decided to explore this by making a series of portraits just to fully understand, like, okay, well, what does this thing think Holly is? And here's some images here of varying degrees of realism, right? Like in the middle, we have, a building that looks like Holly Herndon, right? Like, just so you in there you're kind of getting an understanding of the caricature of Holly, right? She has red lips, ginger hair, somewhat feminine face. She's a white woman, right? On the left, this is getting slightly more realistic. It decided to mimic her. There's the real Holly on the right, kind of fake Holly on the left, which kind of looks a little like Holly archetype. It's not really Holly, but and of course, with this series, toward the end of it, the goal is that by the time all 80 works are minted, we'll get to a point of extreme realism. And so this is, for example, a more recent exploration. As image generators get better and better, it really starts to resemble her. So this is, again, clip guided video. It's a fairly realistic. It's actually clip guided and video guided. So that's, Holly's guiding that with her face. Anyway, so that's some image stuff. But similarly, we've been looking at voice. So Holly did, for her doctorate, this was back in 2016, her doctorate thesis was on ownership of the voice. So looking at historical legal precedent of how to deal with the ownership of your voice, like once it's out there, particularly in an age where all media now can be considered training data for an AI. Who owns it? Like, does anyone get to just go and release music as her with her voice without her permission? Again, you're seeing this a lot now. I saw there was a story in the news yesterday where David Guetta's releasing a song using Eminem's voice or whatever, and we're going to see this increasingly. Again, this would have been 2 or 3 years ago. We started looking at that problem and saying, well, okay, well, how do we use the currently available tools to present maybe an optimistic vision of how this is not some kind of dystopia of people kind of just ripping each other off and, making money off the back of someone else's identity, so on and so forth. How would we structure this in a different way that people could actually get enthusiastic about? And so the product of that was Holly Plus. I believe that you watched a short video before, which is kind of one of the things that was made around this project. But the way we started out doing it is we trained initially a rather crude neural network on Holly's sung voice and created an instrument. It's a web instrument where you can go to holly.plus, you can drag any audio file to Holly Plus. And what it will do is it will sing that audio file back to you in her voice. What's cool about this particular model is it's a bit more abstract. Holly's very well known for creating software to do strange things with her voice. She's been doing that for a very long time. And so what comes back is this very peculiar, polyphonic, sung, almost like choral thing, but it's distinctively Holly. When you hear it, it's like, oh yeah, that sounds kind of like something that would be on a Holly record. These models in the intervening years have, we've refined them to get a lot better, and so we're actually I'll play just a short clip of this for those who maybe didn't see it, but this is the very kind of like hyper realistic model that we're going to release as an instrument this year. With the same process where people will be able to make works using this, and I'll just play it for a second. Okay, so that instrument takes a score, so it can take lyrics and a melody and produce the output, which, it's not the greatest singer you've ever heard in the world. Holly won't mind me saying she's not the greatest singer you've ever heard in the world, but it's a very realistic, it's a very useful tool. The other side to this is that we can take these same models. So this is a piece of software that we co-developed with some researchers in Barcelona, where you can sing through the model, right? So this gets into this whole identity play idea of, what does it sound like, what does it mean for someone to be able to sing in real time through a model rather than just simply generate it? So I'll give you a clip here.
And with this microphone, you'll hear a live version of Holly Plus developed with Voctor Labs.
That's one example that was from TED last year. And here's another example, which is kind of fun, of me singing a song that Holly and I wrote together in her voice. Anyway, okay, so we've already established here, right? You're going to be able to make music with someone else's voice, largely without their permission. You're going to be able to sing as somebody else. You're likely, with these imaging tools, going to be able to present as somebody else as they get better. How do we deal with that, right? Like, the one scenario is, and I kind of believe this, you can't control it. Anyone so motivated will be able to do it. But why would, what are mechanisms that we can develop to make this positive and something that everyone can get, excited about? And so what we did with Holly Plus is we decided to try and build an economy around Holly's models. So we designed this protocol. I actually think it's pretty elegant, where you take a model, you allow for people to co-own that model. So, for example, there's currently a couple of hundred people who have a small ownership share in Holly's disembodied voice. You then release tools to the public to let people use the voice freely. They can do what they want with it, unless, of course, they want to profit from it. In which case they apply to the DAO, so this kind of co-op of people who have a stake in the voice, and the DAO will either approve or deny commercial usage of that media, right? So you have all the good stuff of letting people freely experiment, do what the hell they want, and all the good stuff of saying, well, rather than just be this isolated person out there making a track or a video or something like that with a voice that they like, why wouldn't you come and request approval from the artist in question, and then you can co-sell works together, right? And so we've done an experiment here where, for the first, we released a series of 100 approved works, songs using Holly's voice, and we sold them together with the people who made the songs with the voice. And the way it worked is that 50% of the profits of those sales went to the people who made the song. 40% went back into the co-op so that we could make more instruments to give to people, so that more people could make more songs. And actually that money is what's going to fund the realistic model going forward. And then 10% of those sales go directly to Holly because she donated her IP, right? A friend of ours, JMO, calls this kind of permissive IP. We call it identity play. We think that this kind of, these kind of interactions of kind of leaning into these developments and saying, hey, like, okay, I want you to make work with me or as me, but of course we're going to need some mechanism for me to be able to approve or deny that work, so, just so the world doesn't lose its mind and everyone's always constantly guessing what media came from whom at what point. And we think that the social interactions around there are actually quite powerful. And so we're doing a lot more work, but it's kind of the first experiment of its kind. And I've got a feeling, I mean, some of the details might differ, but I've got a feeling that's what everything's going to look like pretty soon. Because we thought about it a lot and there's not many other options for what you can do, but it's quite elegant, So yeah, if you go to auction.holly.plus, you can find examples there, and we'll be doing another collection of works with the realistic model at some point this year. So all of this comes down to, right, we can do these experiments where we're playing with Holly's identity in the visual realm. we're playing with Holly's identity in the sonic realm. We're figuring out some kind of identity management protocol for how to deal with this disembodied twin. The other side, which is why earlier I alluded to this idea of kind of dealing with the software of others, is you've got big AI, which is now this kind of massive, OpenAI, Microsoft, Alphabet machine learning systems are going to be the substrate for a new kind of internet, right? What do we do about that? There's been a lot of stuff in the press. Some may have heard this about being concerned about the provenance of the data that's being used to train these systems. Without bigging us up too much, I think you'll struggle to find anyone in the world who was talking about this earlier than we were. This was kind of like the premise of a lot of the projects we were doing in 2016, 2017, but now everyone cares about it, and they care about it for good reason. There's not really a kind of mechanism. There's not really a mechanism in place to impede currently really large companies from basically scraping the media, scraping the web of media, training models, and then profiting from that directly. This is kind of like a matter of great ethical and legal concern. I've called it at times the revenge of free media, right? Like, we were all encouraged to go online, share everything about ourselves. And then you look at the terms and conditions, and it turns out that, all your Instagram posts are actually kind of owned by Instagram. So if Instagram goes to OpenAI or Google and says, sure, give us, $100 million and train on everybody, we don't know if there's legal recourse for that. It's a problem. Now, I think that this could, that particular scenario could get so ghoulish that it might not happen because so many people will be upset. But on a technicality, we're kind of in this weird situation where all that media that we've uploaded to the internet and that isn't strictly, only ours, could be fair game, and we have to kind of prepare for that. And so one of the projects we started last year was the site HaveIBeenTrained.com. It's a pun on Have I Been Pwned, which is kind of the a place where you can go to see whether your data has been involved in a breach somewhere. And basically, for any visual artist or anyone just generally, to be honest, you can go to HaveIBeenTrained.com. It lets you use Clip, actually the guidance model I referred to earlier, a system called Clip Retrieval, to search the Lion 5B dataset, which underpins many of the most popular AI image services. And so, for example, if you go in there and type in Holly, you find a gajillion images of Holly. But if you were to go in there, for example, and upload an image of your face, you might find that you were actually in there. So we built Have I Been Trained, which has now kind of turned into a company. And so now we have the art studio now partly runs a company with employees in the United States, really looking at this problem from a very kind of foundational level of saying, okay, currently with Have I Been Trained, we brokered a deal with Stability and Lion themselves to honor artist opt-out requests for the dataset. So in plain English, what that means is if you have artwork in that dataset and you don't want it in there, you can register at Have I Been Trained, identify which artwork is yours, and then we have an API that will send requests out to AI companies to be like, hey, person X doesn't want their work used here. Please, even if legally you don't have to honor their requests, like it would be a kind of a cool thing for you to do. And so over the course of this year, the team at Spawning are working on more systems to, give people more control over their media, i.e. their training data in this new ecosystem. So for example, we're also rolling out an opt-in system. Maybe you want your work in there. Maybe it's going to be really important for everybody, for example, just as you are really concerned what comes up when you type your name in Google or Instagram or something like this, you're probably going to be really concerned what comes up when people type your name into machine learning systems. And currently there's no real way to manage that. So that's what Spawning, the organization, is building. We're framing it as AI identity management. And of course, if you look at our previous projects, the way that we've approached things permissively of saying, okay, what if you were to release some stuff, allow people to play with that? You can kind of infer where we're going with the Spawning project more generally. It's AI identity management, and we actually believe that this will be a new mechanism that will allow for people to actually make money from their IP in this paradigm. Yeah, and nobody else was building it, so we started a company. And I'll probably die 10 years too young. But the yeah, so that's where we're at. I mean, like wrapping all this stuff together, in my mind, there's a clear throughput between the early art projects we were doing in 2012, 2013, thinking about permissions, thinking about the potential of a new web, a lot of the early machine learning work we were doing, worried about data provenance and trying to lean into and be optimistic about the augmentational capacities of these tools. It's all kind of wrapped in. It's all kind of wrapped into both the company and the artworks that we're making at the moment. The other thing to say is we have another kind of parallel AI development project that we're hoping to be presenting in exhibitions, hopefully one in London toward the end of this year or early next year. So I keep an eye out for that. But yeah, so that was, I don't know what the time is, but that was the presentation of work. Hopefully there's enough there to deal with. And if you have any questions, even ones that, maybe sound simple, please feel free to ask. I appreciate that a lot of this stuff is new to a lot of people, but that's all the more reason to ask questions and get excited about it.
Okay, so thanks very much. I guess, does anyone have any questions for Matt? I'm sure there's lots, and I can see Jen biting at the bit with a question. So maybe, if you have a question, I don't know, maybe, hang on, I don't know, maybe this would work. Oh, yeah.
That was really interesting hearing you talk about your interest in protocol and protocol as a piece of art. You've also talked a lot about AI and community as well as connectivity, which through the Jolene video we can see that even Teamrolls has for streaming to happen, they've also used plugins that allow them to stream via real-time streaming protocol and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I love how you said how I'm really curious about what you think about AI and real-time connectivity via protocol, and how through experience of designing protocols for a DAO, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting. I mean, there's a couple of layers to it, right? Specifically for machine learning, one thing that I think is quite interesting that differs a little bit from tech that we've all got used to is, let's say, the amount of compute necessary to run certain things, right? If anyone here has a gaming PC or whatnot, you can kind of do a decent approximation of it. But all of a sudden now to produce this media, it's very computationally expensive. And so that's definitely a dynamic, and I think that that's a dynamic that a lot of AI companies know and are familiar with, right? I anticipate that even though you're going to get, people I'd imagine are in this room who are tinkerers and make their own stuff, will be able to find ways to do things locally and run things locally. The vast majority of this stuff is likely going to happen on interfaces that you don't control. Imagine a scenario in the next 5 years, who knows, 2 years, 5 years, where you're able to customize the movies you watch or whatnot. All of that very resource intensive stuff is likely going to happen on someone else's server. And so thinking about the mechanisms for how one interacts with that is very interesting and very cool. The other side too is, the really stretching the example of protocol. I mean, the reason I love the word protocol is, the Bible, the Quran is a protocol, right? As much as ISPs have protocols or TCP or whatever, it's that this idea of structuring relations around an interaction or giving people a guidelines for how they work. This is work that in an artistic context we're familiar with. There's been some artists who do that strictly with exhibition design, right? Exhibition design in and of itself is a protocol. There's some great old books about exhibition design as protocol from the early 20th century. But I think in the realm of AI, there's just so much work that can be done there specifically. How do you, this is why, crypto gets a bad rap for a lot of the kind of famous catastrophes, but what it gets right in a sense is giving artists or anybody producing something the tools to be able to customize economies or customize interactions around a piece of media, that's not going away, and actually turns out to be really useful in this AI context, you know? And so you bring up a scenario there of like, okay, right now we're at the moment focused like on Holly's IP because we know, like, one, it's ours, and number two, we know we can do that without stepping on anyone's toes. But like, what does it look like when we start imagining models that are co-owned by everyone in the room, like models that are owned by scenes of people? I think all of that is going to actually transpire and happen, particularly given the amount of data necessary to make a really outstanding model of something. And so, yeah, so this kind of collaborative production, collaborative kind of value share that we've seen probably best explored in the DAO space, in the crypto space, I think scans really, really well over to the machine learning question. There just hasn't been too many people diving into that yet, but I think that's only a matter of time. You know, I hope that answered your question. There's a lot there, but I think that's only really a matter of time. And so it's really the deeper question is being like, okay, the more that we depend on these somewhat abstract technical protocols to make a living, you know, to socialize, right? Like, I mean, you all are younger than me. Like, I can only imagine. I was teaching at NYU for a while, and it's like, this is just, you know, these are protocols that you're kind of squeezed into to make a living and make friends. I mean, this is kind of, you know, the more that becomes really clear, I think the more demand there ought to be for people to say, okay, well, what would a protocol I like look like? You know, and the other good side on the AI front is, I don't know if anyone's played with GitHub Copilot or any of these kind of code. So for those who don't know, it's a means, you know, a means for people to code in natural language. So you can say, I want a website that looks like this, and you don't need to know JavaScript or whatnot. For everything I've heard from people who know what they're talking about here, that's going to get easier and easier. So actually thinking about structuring protocols as not being this kind of like really daunting technical challenge for people who maybe don't have that skill set is going to get easier. So that's again why, like, I throw out the provocation of saying I genuinely see protocols as works of art at this point in time. And I think if you look back historically, you can start recasting a lot of the most efficient, most impressive protocols as works of art. I think that they will become more and more a mode of expression. You'll be able to say something about someone by what protocol they adhere to or by what protocol they put out in the world. And of course, I think that already kind of ambiently exists in art anyway. It's just a way of transferring that over to code-based structures that that you can distribute more easily.
I still have like a follow-up question, if that's okay.
Please, yeah.
Because I'm still skeptical of, for example, from like crypto or Web3, there's that standards forum. And I was really interested in how they're able to negotiate. And I'm still really skeptical of like people who own file formats are still the best players in the industry, and like MPEG or like MP4 is still the FFmpeg people are still so powerful because we can't bypass these kind of protocols. And now we have 3D formats with GLTF. I'm trying to think of if there's better dynamics that we can restructure, or what are your thoughts on it? Because
it's pretty interesting. I mean, the closest I can think of, which is a debate that's kind of raging in the AI world at the moment. I mean, I think when you're talking about like file formats, you're right. I mean, you can say the same with like, you know, ICANN and who the jurisdiction over domain names and stuff like this, right? It's like even the best, this gets very quickly into kind of like more moral debates about centralization and decentralization. Of course, there's no easy answer here, but even the best intended, you know, efforts can soon turn into cartels. You know, this is a political problem as well as a technical problem. But the one thing I think it does touch on when you're talking about like structuring new software, thinking about ideal standards, you know, in the AI world right now, there's a debate raging that will not quit. It will be around for a very long time, between centralized approaches, let's say an OpenAI. By centralized there, I mean, they kind of, you know, they're very opinionated about what they release, how you can interact with it. For example, when you're on ChatGPT or whatever, it allows certain opinions and not others, versus, let's say, a stability AI approach, which is going for the more decentralized approach of being like, let's just give everyone these models, right? And we're this is the decentralized kind of open environment. If I'm absolutely honest, depending on case by case, I see arguments for both sides. I think that OpenAI is a very responsible organization in what they do, and I think sometimes I think stability can be a bit too cavalier in what they're doing. But I think more broadly, that negotiating that debate between like control and openness there's no easy answer, but it's but it's fascinating. It's something to negotiate case by case. And I think again, some of the projects we do, it's like trying to find that happy medium. Again, talking about JMO's framing of permissive IP, it's like the happy medium is accepting that information is going to be like water and should be freely available to everybody, but then building enough tools in place to make sure that it's not just a total Wild West. My gut says that the sediment will eventually kind of settle somewhere in the middle there, where in actuality, for example, with Holly Plus or some of the spawning stuff we're doing, we talk a lot about consent. And I'm like, yeah, like, you don't want to shut the internet down. You don't want a world where, you have to go through numerous different authorities in order to be able to use someone's style. But what you will find is that there's more reasons to work in a consenting manner with an artist or a brand or whoever it might be than there is to just kind of bootleg it. There's actually all kind of ways to nudge people or kind of guide people to doing the right thing, because it's more advantageous for them to do that, right? And the example I give there, we use this with Holly Plus all the time. If you think about remixing, which is again it's an old metaphor, but like, if you go on SoundCloud, there's probably tens of thousands of Lady Gaga remixes out there, but the one that she chooses is the one that benefits the producer the most, right? Like, that's the one that gets played. That's the one that she, so there's all kind of ways that social protocols can actually compensate for the openness of technical protocols is what I'm saying. So yeah, but I'm not hardline on either way. I think that, a full on libertarian decentralized existence is, there's a lot of great ideas there, but I don't know if we want to live in that world, just as we don't want to live in a world where like 3 companies control the internet or AI, somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Great. Any, yeah. Yeah. Can you hear now?
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, hello, I'm Richard. I think I seen is Holly also in RCF20 last year?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, that's right. I remember the orange hair. So nice. Yeah, it's also because I really like the way you make the AI kind of decentralized, or you intend to put it in that way, which is, I think it's lack of discussion with the current trending, because people are like kind of, especially some artists, especially artists from our station, are kind of super like it's kind of freaking out by this trending. And I really think you are building something to let them to speak out in a very, I think, natural and systematic way. But in that way, I want to ask, like, if ideally, like, there's a magic in the world, can realize everything you want, what do you think is the most ideal way to let AI to learning from artists' work? For example, do you hope all artists opt out or opt in through your source from AI? Or do you think, for example, from my side, or imagine, okay, it maybe in future, each time we call like Midjourney or AI model to have a work and we sold it, it can calculate the portion or contribution of each artist. For example, if I mention Greg, what's his name? Greg Rakowski.
Greg Rakowski, yeah.
Yeah. If I
classic
in the keywords, and it's well like, okay, his portion took out like 20%, and he take 20% of income. I don't know what's the ideal way of you think like future AIs to learn from artists to deal with that.
It's a great question. So I'll explain my bias. Without going too deep into how the diffusion process works, so diffusion is the technique that contributes to Midjourney using these data sets. I personally take the opinion that it's a lot of people have made this suggestion that you just made. It's a very sensical claim in some senses, that you would be able to determine, cleanly whose work contributed to what, and then apportion some revenue to them for that. I personally think it's not going to work. And first off is that you still have to make a really opinionated ideological decision there. I actually spoke to, for example, you can go to a website called stableattribution.com. It launched last week. They have this idea, and they're very smart people. And they've tried to come up with an algorithm to determine from an AI image how much one image went in there. The problem is there's a really long tail. So what they do is they're like, we think these 10 images are the closest. But then when you look at the 11th image, actually the 11th image is only 0.000000000001% less similar than the 10th image and the 12th image. So in actuality, it's very difficult to determine this. And you have to make a very strong ideological point of being like, okay, we're going to choose the top 10 similar images. And then, but it doesn't work super well. I think personally where it will go, two things. We're interested in opt-in. And I think opt-in looks like this. To have a working opt-in, you need a working opt-out, right? So let's say you're a visual artist. I'm just going to presume, right? So let's say you're a visual artist. If you want to be able to build anything in this kind of ecosystem where, let's say, you're releasing a private model, kind of like Holly did, you're going to need assurances that the data that contributed to that is not freely available elsewhere, right? I also think that one thing that we're toying with at the moment is kind of making a kind of social ritual of this, right? Where your work that you really like, your kind of finished work that's gone through all of this process needs to be opted out. But it turns out on your hard drive, you might have 10 times more, 100 times more work that doesn't meet your standards that would be perfectly sufficient for training an AI, right? And so what we're trying to think about is exactly that middle ground of being like, look, we're going to have to live with this. There's a way for you to exist ambiently in these large models without giving away the stuff that you value, right? And the benefit to you is, one, you're going to want to be present, right? I mean, in ArtStation DeviantArt, I think a lot of people are coming at this, and I sympathize with them. They're coming at this very cold. You know, it kind of arrived like a UFO out of the sky, right? And they're like terrified, and the press likes to get clicks. So the press is like, it's the end of artists, you're going to die. You know, it's like, it's silly, right? But I think where realistically it's going to go is finding some balance where actually you're able to negotiate how much of yourself you want to be freely available for this kind of caricature pastiche, and how much of yourself you want to hold back. And that's why with spawning, we talk about identity management, because it's not about being a data cop. It's not about being like, I don't want anything to do with it. Let's go make music with banjos and paintbrushes and make art with paintbrushes. Like, we're not advocating for that. Realistically, what you need is a means to exist harmoniously with this world, right? And so, yeah, so some of the projects we're going to do this year are playing with that, of being like, how would you be able to opt in a way that you felt really good about? And how would you maybe get benefits for contributing your data? But what I would say is, even though I don't think the suggestion's insane, the idea of kind of like per generation compensation based on something, blah, blah, blah. The other problem with that is, we know, I've been very critical of Spotify in my time, these kind of pro rata micropayment systems, they were a dream of Web 1 people before Web 2 came around. And I personally don't think that economy works. I just don't. It works for a very small group of people that, to be honest, would have won anyway. You know what I mean? Like, Beyonce was going to make a hell of a lot of money, whatever system Spotify used. And it turns out that really the top 0.1% are the only people making significant money from this kind of stuff. And so I wouldn't personally recommend repeating that, because ultimately, the great benefit is, this is going to be, we're entering into a system of new internets. There's going to be an AI substrate internet that interacts with the other internet. There's a whole crypto Web3 thing, which will likely play a role in where these internets are going to go. We get to kind of reimagine what one IP looks like. We get to reimagine what value share looks like. So I would say that, the metaphor of, even though micropayments is probably a role for this, like, but that metaphor of making it look a little bit like the experiments in Web 2, I don't think it isn't where I would take it personally, but yeah.
Thanks so much. That's so inspiring and make react film like I don't know how the artists on our station reacted, but I think it's a huge contribution. I think they should go in this way.
Thank you. You should tell them that. I had my Twitter was full of like 10,000 screaming furries at some point. So but eventually I think they'll realize that we mean really well. We're just
We also need that kind of education work to let them know how it works.
I think that's it. And the other side too is, there's a really fine line between being alarmist or catastrophist about this and being a realist, right? And like being a realist, this is inevitable. Like on the research level, right? Like for those who maybe aren't following this every day, you can now prompt scenes in movies with discrete camera directions, the generations that like this stuff is going to get so good so quickly that everyone's going to use it, because even with ethical concerns, which some of which are very legitimate, people use cool stuff and it's just getting so good, so you kind of have to prepare for that world and just be like, look, yeah, there's a lot of things that can be smoothed over, but I think once you make that psychological leap where you're like, okay, a lot of bad stuff's going to exist, but what's the good stuff we could build now that we could never build before? Work on that, because there's a real dearth of ideas there. And I feel very confident that's the stuff that's going to win. Like that's the stuff that it elevated above the current conversations of like big AI versus artists. It's like, no, it's like, it's going to be all artists are using AI somehow. How do we make that really cool and distinct from the 20th century? Like what new affordances, new abilities do we have to make this way cooler than stuff we could do 10 years ago? And there's no shortage of cool stuff you can think of, as long as you lean into it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions for Matt? Yeah. Who's that?
Can you hear me okay, Matt?
I can.
I'll come to the front. My name's Adam. Nice to meet you.
Hey, nice to meet you.
I have a question about obviously like the freemium models of Web 2.0, where these large companies harvest our data in exchange for access. I'm really fascinated by this idea of an identity management tool. We've talked about it before internally, and it seems like you guys are like making it at the moment, which is fantastic. Do you imagine this could potentially be a tool in future where we can control not just the work that we create, but also the data that we allow brands to have access to? Could this be like a way of us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I have to concede, it's like I have a lot of friends in fashion, for example, and it's not my world particularly, but I am in their ear, and it's like, yeah, this is a greater problem. I actually wrote a short essay for Art Review on this. It was called, I can't remember what it was called, but it was on consent and the revenge of free media, but specifically about this, where like that freemium model of Web 2, by my interpretation, it kind of allowed, it was like giving free stuff to the biggest fish, who over time, you've seen this in subcultures, you see this likely in the fashion world, right? It's like that idea is out there. If that gets enough attention within 2 weeks, that is, already being manufactured by somebody else, or kind of, and so this kind of slide, it's like the concern about appropriation or whatever in an AI context. I'm like, well, we've already set a pretty bad precedent for that, right? Because Web 2 implicitly, the protocol of Web 2 didn't care about where an idea came from. It cared about who brought the most attention to an idea, which is different, right? So it's like, that's why, Kanye has like surveillance monitors around Berlin, right? It's like, that's why like everybody, that's why I'm careful about bringing up ideas in certain contexts, because everyone's getting paid by somebody else to find an idea that they've mood boarded from somewhere here, right? And so, yeah, I think that's bad precedent for an AI context, because ultimately it's unhealthy, because as anyone will know, like ideas have to come from somewhere, right? And so it's not that there's ever been a perfect system for this, but there's always been very influential fringe cultures that have contributed there, and having that kind of harmonious interdependent ecosystem has kept the ideas flowing. It's kept things kind of moving. And so the problem with adding automation to that recipe is I could right now, if I was so motivated, write a bot to scrape all my fashion friends, followers, friends, right? Scrape everything, wrap that in a model and sell it tomorrow, right? Yeah. I'm not going to do that, but someone could do that. And it's just kind of an inevitability. And so I think I agree. I mean, I was speaking to a journalist about this recently, like she was also concerned there about like Instagram data, so on and so forth. If we can establish a precedent where we can say, okay, we already have this API, we have some, some small application that you can wrap into your code to give people more control over their work. Some people will choose some stuff. I in a dream world, I think in like a few years' time, there's just simply a button on every interface where you're asked to share media, where you choose if this goes to your kind of identity in some in some remote model or doesn't, right? And I think that like, nobody else has worked on that yet. Someone else will likely work on that, maybe faster than we will. But we feel it's really important at this point as I say, almost as an artistic gesture to be like, look, this can be done, right? It's like, and actually, I think it's a precondition for this economy to flourish, actually, because what you'll have is the second that kind of data scraping dynamic gets so, faster, more instantaneous, and people feel like they're being ripped off, they're just going to switch off. Like there's a whole world where people are just like, and I feel like that already happens in arts, fashion, music to some extent, right? Like a lot of people now are like, I'm just not going to share anything. Like that's like I have no incentive to share things anymore. And so finding that balance is really important. But you're right. I think it goes way beyond art per se. It's really about, managing what of you ends up where,
It's really fascinating. Thanks. That's a good answer. Cheers.
No, of course. Pleasure.
I realize that we're sort of running slightly over time. So I guess if there is no other questions, I guess the final question I just have to actually like in some way to sort of mimic or take influence from Interdependence and your sort of ritual of asking your kind of guests kind of final question. I guess this summit was kind of framed around the question of what kind of technologies do we want to live with? So I was just kind of curious in terms of what kind of technologies do you kind of, would you like to live with? And I guess now that you're a parent, what kind of technologies would you like your child to live with, I guess?
It's a good question because I've definitely been like, should we go Steve Jobs and like not give the kid access to a computer for their first 13 years? I'm definitely contemplating that. I heard that recently about like a Samsung executive too. It might be complete rubbish. No, it's a good question. I mean, I think just generally it's like we're definitely the tech optimist side of things. Like, I've been very fortunate in my life to meet a lot of people who are in decision-making positions about some of these issues. And fundamentally, I think that everyone's kind of on the same page there. Like there's a lot of good people thinking about this. I think that incentives, funding structures, competition start to complicate these things over time. There is this, people talk about the paperclip factory and AI alignment and so on and so forth. Like there is this kind of odd scenario we're in at the moment where I have a lot of respect for OpenAI, where, there could be a lot of gains made from people making kind of careless technology in order to beat competitors out. I really hope that doesn't happen. But I think fundamentally it's like I personally have, and a lot of our projects for the next year, particularly the exhibition work, will touch on this. I think we have a pretty robust argument for a culture of consent and trust actually being the best thing for artists and the best thing for AI development long term. And so that's the kind of tech I want to live with, is tech that feels like it's, making your whatever's on your mind feel more possible in the world without you feeling like there's some catch, And I think that it's very optimistic or idealistic to expect that, but I think that we can do our best at least while we're kind of in these early stages of whatever the AI internet is going to be. We can do our best to kind of insist on that while there's still time, And so I think, I'm certainly not like a doomer or a cynic about any of this stuff. I just think that there's some narratives that aren't properly articulated. And I think part of the problem is, oftentimes we're trained, particularly from an arts context, to be critical, but not be like productively critical, right? It's like, and that's why, again, I think, we really insist is like when we put these protocols together, it's like we do it not because we want to be like, oh, these people are terrible, but because we're like, no, I think you can do this better, right? And then like, I think this could be far better for people. And so that's why, again, I try and encourage for anyone who like has an idea about this. It's like a criticism is basically the foundational raw material you use for building a proposal, right? And that proposal can be, critical, or it can be funny or whatever it might mean, but there needs to be more of that, because actually in the world of like venture capital and the real like bottom line world, there's so little room for that sometimes consensus can develop that makes bad things come from ostensibly quite well-meaning people. And for me, that's also the realm of the arts. It's like, if the arts is going to justify its existence in any way, it's to be creating an alternate something that wouldn't be funded by the market traditionally or something like that. That's why we do it, I think, right? And so yeah, and I think there's a lot of room to put that vision forward now, and there's going to be more interested than ever. So that's a very long-winded answer, but that's my feeling.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks so much for such an amazing talk. So thanks again. And hope you managed to get some sleep.
Yeah, in a couple of months. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of years, you'll be fine. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest. Say hello to Callum.
I will do.
Bye. Take care.